Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a really exciting session starting now about overfishing, sea ice changes, and how overfishing might also impact the Arctic Ocean looking towards the future. So without further ado, I'll introduce Rebecca Hubbard from Our Fish to kick off this really fantastic session. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Rebecca Hubbard. I'm the Program Director with Our Fish, and thank you for coming to our event. How can ending overfishing mitigate climate change? Our Fish and Seas at Risk are hosting this event, and thanks to the Cryosphere Pavilion for having us. We have some food here if you'd like to grab some lunch, because this is lunch hour. And we'll first of all, start with a short film on how the ocean regulates the climate and how fisheries are interconnected with that. So without further ado, I will put that film on.
The rate of climate change is in part determined by the oceans and the state of the ocean.
So a healthy ocean is capable of slowing the rate of climate change substantially. The biggest impact on the environment and the sea has been from fishing. So what we do in extracting fish is generally to remove the top layer of the food web first. And that has led to a huge change in the ecosystem in the sea.
Altså, fisken er forsvundet fra kysten hele vejen op langs, helt op til Hanstholm. Og i de indre farvand er den også ved at være væk, fisken. Så det er heroppe i Skagerrak, vi endnu har fisk inde ved kysten. Og vi har det, fordi vi endnu ikke har haft det her ødelæggende bomtravls, flyshooter og bundtravlsfiskeri, det tunge bundtravlsfiskeri. Det er derfor, vi har det.
Det bliver sgu ringere og ringere, og der er jo mange det er for mig hjemmeby.
Because of the computer.
Maybe I'll just start. Okay. Maybe the video will crash the system again, so we might just get started with the actual presentations. So as a little bit of context and background for why we're here today and why we're looking at how ending overfishing can mitigate climate change, there's been quite a bit of increasing research into the impact of climate change on fisheries. But what we found to be an interesting idea was to turn that around and say, but what would it look like? What is the impact of increasing and restoring our fish populations, and how could that help mitigate climate change and help contribute something positively to the fight against the climate crisis? A groundbreaking new study from Dr. Rashid Sumaila and Travis Tai at the University of British Columbia shows that ending overfishing is essential in building resilience and can mitigate the impacts of climate change. So today, our panel of experts will be, who covers a variety of fields. We have people from science, from the government, from NGOs, looking at what is the interaction between fish, the ocean, and the climate. And we'll be discussing and exploring the role of fish in the carbon cycle and marine ecosystems, the repercussions for the Arctic, and discuss how fulfilling existing commitments to end overfishing is decisive climate action, and that states and countries can deliver right now, this year, even in the EU's case, in 2 weeks' time. So today we'll start the presentations with Dr. Rashid Sumaila, And then after 2 presentations, we'll move on to a panel discussion with our range of experts. So Dr. Rashid Sumaila is a professor and research chair in interdisciplinary ocean and fisheries economics and director of fisheries in the economics research unit in the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Dr. Sumaila is a multi-award winning fisheries and economics expert and has co-authored this recent paper, Ending Overfishing Can Mitigate the Impacts of Climate Change. I'd like to welcome Dr. Sumaila. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I saw you said Mr. and you quickly changed to no. I'm also a Mr. Okay, yeah. So it's part of the deal. So thank you all for coming. There's so much going on in this house, and you took the time to come here. That is very much appreciated. And yeah, so quickly, I have just 10 minutes to say a few things. The panel will come, and it's in the Q&A that the interaction we get. That's where we get more. Okay, so. Essentially, this is the main figure. This is the main figure that actually supports the work we have reported in the analysis we did. This is a very nice way of capturing the concept of overfishing in one figure. That says a lot, you know. So when you mention overfishing, people think of taking too much fish that nature can give back. So you are taking more than the growth, which is actually the big way of looking at it. But if you look deeper, you are doing that, you are taking too much, but you are also taking the big fish, first, the most valuable fish, we take them. And by doing that, you are truncating the food web, the natural food web. You have a food web, and fish and animals are all connected in the ocean. Some eat, some are predators, some are prey, and this is well designed for the system to be sustainable. So we take the big fish, and that is part of overfishing. Now, the third thing you will see is the habitat. At the bottom here, something is also happening. In the beginning, it's richer, right? You see more habitat. As we fish, the gear we use, bottom trawling and all that, we're also destroying the home of the fish. All these 3 things come together to make the fish stocks and the marine ecosystem less resilient, right? Once somebody says this, it makes sense. It's like a human being, right? If your home is gone, you are in trouble, huh? Homeless people, you know. Or if you are sick and there's a flu running through your city, you are more likely to be knocked down than somebody who is healthy. The same with fish. People and fish are not that different. So this actually is the main idea behind our paper. But added to that is the issue of how much fishing you are doing has also meanings for the resilience of the system. Because if you are taking too much fish, you end up with less fish in the ocean. That means you have to work harder, you have to go further, you have to go deeper. All that means you are pumping out more CO2 than you would need. And that feeds back into climate change, making things worse. So that's another channel, and it's good to know that. The last channel through which that this happens is what you will be talking about after me. It turns out that when you have more life in the ocean, an ocean full of life is also an ocean that can sequester more carbon. There's evidence coming more and more. You have more large animals going up and down and taking stuff down. Their poo, for example, contains carbon. So they absorb, and that again feeds into less climate change and therefore makes the system more resilient. So this is really the key point to remember from this. The rest are details, how you nail this down. And we'll get more filling up from my colleague here, and then, yeah, we go in. So having said that, we know that climate change is actually doing things to the system. That's what this whole conference is about. In terms of life in the ocean, there are three or four very important things happening. You have the warming of the ocean. And again, fish are like people. You see, when I was coming, I took out my jacket. I was feeling hot. If you allow me, I'll take off this, right? I can do it. Or if it's too hot, I open the window or put on the air condition. If it is too cold, if it's too cold, you put on the heater, right? The fish cannot do this. When it's out of their range, they either move and follow the temperature, or if they cannot, they perish, right? So that is the situation. And so warming is affecting. And there's a lot of literature on this, right? And it's growing. Sea ice melting, if you're from the Arctic, you know what this is, right? The last week or so, there was a report in northern Canada, in Arctic Canada. First Nations, indigenous people, you know what is happening very often, much more than before? They're walking on the ice and suddenly it goes. They actually get swallowed up by the ice, if you like, because it's soft and you don't know until you step on it and you go, right? So there's a lot happening with the animals too. Acidification, oh my gosh, that's another big one. So the fish are moving away from the equator because it's too hot. They go towards the poles. And actually, the Arctic is the hot spot for ocean acidification because of all the processes going there. So it's like the fish is moving out of hot water into acidic water. Think about that. I mean, this scares me a lot, actually. And then you have deoxygenation. If you are from the Pacific Ocean, around the North Pacific, actually is also one of the hot spots for deoxygenation. Because of all, again, climate change and all the processes, we are losing oxygen in the water. And people have talked a lot about that. So in this paper, we tried to nail this down, one of the early papers we did on climate change running through. So you have all these biophysical things happening there. They obviously will affect the animals at different levels and end up affecting the fish. So you find many papers talking about this direction, but not much talking about what fishing can do to the ecosystem. And this is where our fish and seas at risk and all this kind of partnership is trying to really bring to the table. Okay? So very nice. And all this we are doing is actually, I'm an economist, so I love nature, I love the ecosystem, marine ecosystem, but actually what I do is at the end of the day about people. So this is, at the end of the day, it's all about people. The temperature, climate, I don't even know whether the fish cares, right? I can't talk to the fish, right? But I know that when your fish is gone, it has impact on people. So ultimately, that is the point. This is a representation by our group and by the FAO, and the direction is clear. More and more over time, we're taking fish from depleted systems, and therefore making it weak, if you do. And these are the human consequences. So this guy goes out, number of hours, is that all the fish I get, the shrimp I get? And this is an example of an environmental refugee. Sea level rise, no fish, nothing to do. You know what? People don't just sit down and die. People move when life is too hard. And so we're going to get more of this as all these things are happening. So we better start fixing this. And this is what drives me, right? I mean, we are in Spain now, and the story of West Africans getting on boats, dangerous stuff, to get to Europe, is partly attributed to this. And so the Africans are at risk. Of course, they are not happy, that's why they are moving. And the Europeans are not happy, and we are all in a bad space. So let's fix climate change, let's fish overfishing, because it has implications in so many different ways. New literature is beginning to show up, and this is something that has come out not too long, both of them last year. William Chang is our colleague and his co-authors. What they found out is if you don't fish more than the fish can provide you, that's what maximum sustainable yield is. It's nature. But actually, it can relate this to every human being. If you have a bank account, right? So you put 1,000 euros, January, midnight, December 31st. Midnight the next year, if you are promised a 10% interest rate, this is too high. Today they don't give you that. If you don't take time, actually they give you negative discount rate if you take in inflation. But let's assume 10%, right? So at the end of December, you have 1,100. If you keep taking $100 each year, you can do this forever. That's sustainability. But if you take 200, then you end up with 900 at the beginning of the new year. And therefore, you don't get $100, you get 90. If you insist on 200 very soon, you go to the bank and they'll call the police for you. You have no money in the bank. That's what is happening to the fish. And if you if you overdo it, it's trouble. But this paper shows that if you stay within MSY, you are able to reduce the risk of extinction of fish biomass by up to 63%. So sustainable fisheries are good. They are able to withstand climate impacts more. And similarly, this is another one from Steve Gaines, where they look at what good management does, which is actually, again, about overfishing. If you have a solid management system, you don't overfish. And if you don't overfish, you kind of mitigate the impacts of climate change. What else do I have to say? This is a new model that I've been trying to develop, and it's kind of lifting off and saying that really, for us to be able to manage the relationship between people and nature, we have to think deep. When we put policies in place or take actions, we have to make sure that these actions and policies we put in place lead to positive feedback from people to nature and nature to people. If you put policies that lead to negative feedback, which is what we seem to be doing, it's terrible, because you get into a vicious cycle, and subsidies is one big one, right? Marine protection is another. At the moment, more than 80% of the subsidies we give to the fishing sector goes to large-scale industrial fishing fleets. So you disadvantage the small communities that depend on fish for food security. And so they hang on the last fish, and so the environment goes down, and it doesn't give them more, and you are in that negative. So we have to think very hard. This is a very quick illustration of this. This is the paper I mentioned. About 80% of all the subsidies goes to large scale, and most of what they get are actually what we describe as bad subsidies. And I could go on, but I know time is of the essence. My last point is, we also have to think of the ocean as one global ocean. We put all sorts of definitions and boundaries, but the fish don't know this, right? If you look at the light blue, this is what we call country waters, within 200 nautical miles from your coast, agreed by the UN. The dark blue areas are the high seas. So you can manage your EEZ, your country waters, as best as possible. If the high seas is not well done, you can still fail. So what you do in the blue areas can impact what happens here. And to be able to reduce overfishing, we have to think about the whole thing. I like to joke. I say, Mexican fish, American fish, they don't care. They go where they go. They don't need visa. French fish, Brexit, whether they do Brexit or not, the fish don't care. So we need to manage this as a whole. And all right, so finally, the evidence is mounting. You need a strong fish stock. You stop overfishing, and you make it a lot better for all of us, given everything being constant. It's like a person, I've said that. And in this way, people and fish are not that different, right? I mean, it's amazing. The people who are in genetics know this. Me and whatever, 99% similarities in genes, right? So it's quite close. And we do have support. The global system has already made agreements. We have the IPCC, we have IP-BES, we have all sorts of the sustainable development goals all saying. So our governments have already committed to all the things we are saying. All we need to do is to push them to meet their commitment. And I say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rashid. We will continue now with the next presentation from Angela, because it continues with this scene setting in terms of providing the scientific context and background for what we're talking about here, and then we'll go into questions and answers with the full panel. I will just navigate the technology. And find the thing. It worked really well before we started, but I've lost the cursor completely.
Oh my God.
Oh, it's behind us.
No, it's this one.
Sorry. Perfect. Excellent. So Angela Martin is a research fellow at the Centre for Coastal Research at the University of Agder in Norway. And Angela was the leader of the project Blue Climate Solutions, and is an expert in fish carbon. So if you didn't know there was an expert in fish carbon, she exists, and she's with us today, Angela. She's going to describe for us how fish and marine vertebrates, provide important carbon services that help maintain the ocean's role in climate regulation, and give us a little bit more background on how we can understand the important role of fish in the system. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. So yeah, I'm with the Centre for Coastal Research in Norway at the University of Agder, and I also represent Women for Oceans, which is an organisation working for gender equality in the ocean sector. And before I start with this, I do want to point out that for climate change, we need to reduce emissions and we need to address social injustice and environmental injustice. So just a tip of the hat there to people in Chile who are pushing for social change at the moment. But right now we need to also look at emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So I will talk about the role of fish. So the ocean is a carbon sink, which basically means that it absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases. And there's two drivers of the ocean carbon sink. One is physical and one is biological. I'm just going to skip through these because it's a bit technical. But the ocean is already included in many NDCs. Looking at coastal ecosystems, we have seagrass and mangroves that are featured in lots of different countries, nationally determined contributions to climate change. But the focus there is on plants, which is fine because they photosynthesize, they stabilize sediments, they can move carbon from the water column into the sediment and store it for thousands of years. But fish also have an integral role in the carbon cycle, in the ocean carbon cycle. So they directly interact with carbon through their life processes and through their behavior, and also they interact indirectly with carbon through trophic interactions, and they provide nutrients for photosynthesis. It gets a bit complicated after that point because there's many different outcomes associated with the carbon that the fish interact with, and nothing is linear. So the carbon can be released back to the atmosphere, it can be fixed where nutrients have been provided, it can be cycled, which means basically the fish doesn't really change the carbon. It can be moved upward through the water column or downward through the water column. It can be, if it's moved downward to deeper waters or to sediment, it can be stored, which is I've defined as held for up to 100 years, or it can be sequestered, which is held for over 100 years. And all of these outcomes will depend on the ecosystem, on the behavior of the fish, on the form of the carbon. So yes, it's very complicated. So these were those functional interactions. We've got respiration, teleost carbonate, which is teleost fish, which is most fish. They drink seawater constantly, but they can't cope with a lot of the products in the seawater. So to get rid of those, they metabolize these carbonates and they release those constantly. There's carbon in fish poop, and there's carbon in the fish themselves, and obviously when they die, that carbon has another outcome. And these are those outcomes, the potential outcomes associated with each of the interactions. Again, like I said, it's not linear. There's several outcomes associated with each interaction. And that's the same story for the behavioral interactions too. So fish, the picture depicts mammals as well, but fish also do this. So they migrate across ecosystems between habitats and even within habitats, which is horizontal transfer. And then they can vertically transfer carbon, where they move from surface to depth, from depth to surface. And then extrinsic transfer, that's where they interact with the carbon in their environment already. So, for example, fish that build nests with algae, which has a high carbon content. Again, the outcomes are very complicated. We don't know essentially what happens to the carbon associated with each of these interactions, but they are doing something. And then the indirect interactions with carbon, so provision of nutrients, that can enable photosynthesis. So that one's quite an easy thing to say, this is the outcome. and trophic interactions where grazers can maintain coastal habitats, so seagrasses are maintained. We know by grazing by turtles and dugongs, so there's not fish, but we expect fish probably do something similar in some ecosystems. And then predation, where fish and other animals can predate on the grazers and maintain those carbon fixing interactions by the plants. And also predation of bioturbators, which are things that dig into sediments and can release carbon from sediments. Fish can maintain the populations of those so they don't get too many and release carbon. Again, the carbon outcomes are kind of complicated. There's several associated with the trophic interactions, again depending on the environment, the form of the carbon, and the nutrient pump is a bit more simple. But these outcomes are very hard to estimate. We don't know how much. There's been a few studies where people have looked at carbon associated with a particular species or in a particular habitat or related to a particular interaction, but they're very small, very few and far between. So we don't know. But what we do know is fish do have a role in the carbon cycle, in the ocean carbon cycle, and we do know that the ocean is a carbon sink. So we know we can't just ignore them. And so here I've put the precautionary approach up, which says that just because you don't know enough about something isn't a reason not to act if you see that your action will have a detrimental effect. And this has also been raised in the high-level panel report on ocean solutions, which was released earlier this year. So that report said that populations of vertebrates are an important component of the carbon cycle in ocean ecosystems, and they should be given consideration when we develop policies to secure nature-based carbon function. And beyond this, we've brought the ocean here to the climate meeting, but we also need to bring the climate to ocean meetings. So more than 60% of the ocean is in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and there are continuing discussions about this area of the sea at the UN ongoing over the next couple of years. So we need to make sure that climate is also included in those. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Angela. That was extremely enlightening and a little bit overwhelming. But really excellent to see that that there is some research done and obviously more room for more research, but obviously also that the fish do definitely have an important part to play in the biological pump and in the carbon cycle in the ocean. So I'd like now to invite our two speakers, but also the rest of our panel, up for a question and answer session. We have with us Martin Sommerkorn, who is with the WWF Arctic Program and one of the co-authors of the recent IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. Martin, if you'd like to come up, and Dr. Jacob Hagberg, who is a senior scientific officer with the Swedish Ministry of Environment, who can give us a government perspective, and Dr. Monica Verbeek, who is the executive director of Seas at Risk and a long-term marine conservation advocate. Would Angela and Rashid, would you like to also come up? So I'll just start with a couple of questions to our new panellists to get your perspectives on the role of overfishing and fish and climate change and climate action. But I need to give you a microphone. So I'll start with you, Martin. How does, because we're in the cryosphere pavilion, and of course there are plenty of fish in the cryosphere, and as Rashid said, the pressures on fish in the Arctic and the Antarctic are different to those in the tropical waters. So how does climate change impact Arctic fish communities and marine ecosystems? And in terms of what we're looking at here, in terms of climate action, how can we build resilience in those communities and ecosystems? You just have to turn it on. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to give you a perspective from a non-fisheries person. So, because that's what I am. I'm an Arctic ecosystem ecologist, and I have been coordinating the Polar Regions chapter of the recent IPCC report. So I'm mostly referring to that actually in my deliberations here. As you know, there are several of the world's largest fisheries are linked to the Arctic Ocean. There is a rich resource of fishes, and it's also richly fished by a number of stakeholders, industrial and also local communities. If you bear with me a second, conjure in your head actually a poleward view of the Arctic Ocean, so not the normal view of looking at the world, but just hover over the North Pole for a while, you will actually see that in the center of that ocean there's a huge lid of sea ice. And that sea ice has been under real critical pressure over the last 50 years. We have lost huge amounts of the area of that extent of that sea ice. We have lost almost all of the multi-year sea ice of that. So the current Arctic sea ice system is almost composed fully of annual ice, which drifts around. And obviously, for anybody who knows a little bit about oceanography, that lid, that Arctic sea ice lid on the ocean determines a lot of the oceanography, but it also determines a lot about how the ocean actually works ecologically. And on top of that, in the middle of that Arctic Ocean, there is a deep basin, and the whole and surrounding most of the Arctic is actually our extensive shelf. And it's actually mostly these shelf seas that are contributing to fisheries. And it's also mostly these shelf seas where the ice has been for the last centuries actually retreating from during summer months and coming. So that's important to have in mind when we talk about these changes, because they are not happening in a general Arctic view, especially only over those areas that are important for fisheries. So let me do this a little further. So we have seen about 13, you have to correct your slide, 13% per decade loss of sea ice over the recent decades, which is actually hugely substantial in the month of September. So summer sea ice has declined by 13% per decade over the last 40 years. And it is still there in winter, but it has actually receded in all months of the year. And that affects a lot of the primary productivity, and we have seen that in the observations, and also the secondary productivity. Starting with the plankton side of things, it has changed the composition of zooplankton towards smaller communities with smaller biodiversity. It has, however, in the recent past also overall led to some instances of increased primary productivity, and that is regionally different. And over some of the shelf seas where the ice has actually receded, we have seen increased primary productivity, for example, over increased amounts of plankton blooms. So it's a very complex picture as we see it, and to just look at one sector that is a critical sector for the geographical sector for the warming Arctic Ocean, it is that the Barents Sea has warmed the most of all these regional seas of the Arctic. And there we have actually seen what we call a borealization of fish communities already ongoing. It was detected looking at a comparison between, for example, 2004 and 2012 fish communities. We have seen a huge borealization. So the typical Arctic fish communities have been pressed to the north, whereas the boreal ones expand. And because, let's put it this way, this is a well-managed fishery, we can debate that, what that means, well-managed fishery. There actually has not been a catastrophic collapse there, but yields have been sustained. But one has to have in mind that the Arctic fish communities, which are actually not fisheries, have been pushed north, and there is a distinct edge to their expansion northwards because there's a shelf break coming. Then I'll stop soon, I guess. There's a lot to say. Looking forward, and we can go into details and question what that means, what has it meant, for example, in the Bering Sea and Strait. But looking forward, the picture is actually quite bleak, in a way. And in some ways, it seems to be not that bleak, and I will elaborate on this. It is bleak when you look at what is forecast in terms of physical oceanography for the Arctic Ocean. Under high emission scenarios, we will actually see year-round corrosive conditions for shell-building organisms everywhere in the Arctic by the end of this century. Under emission scenarios that are congruent with the Paris Agreement, we will see much less of that area having these conditions year-round. We will also see, coming back to the sea ice, we will also see under a 1.5 degree scenario about a sea ice-free Arctic summer at the end of the century occurring around once in a century. Whereas under even 2 degrees, it's going to be about every 3rd to 10th year. And under higher emission scenarios, I'm afraid we won't see any Arctic summer ice any longer in the second half of this century. So this will, in effect, in all theory, make the Arctic Ocean more productive. But I don't think actually personally that is how it's going to pan out, for example, due to the reasons of ocean acidification, but also because everybody who knows something about ecosystems knows that these transitions are not going to be smooth. They're going to come towards us in terms of disturbances. And some of these disturbances we have seen recently are coming to us towards the loss of sea ice. So, for example, there has been something that I would not with my IPCC hat on, almost term ecosystem collapse this year in the Bering Sea, where we have seen massive die-offs of birds, massive die-offs of seals, and these were linked to sea ice in the first interpretations because a vector, a virus, could actually go that far north because the sea ice conditions of the last 3-4 years, well, there has been basically no sea ice in the Bering Sea. So these are the kind of disturbances. On top of that, the Arctic and the tropics are the 2 regions of this planet that will see the most of the intensity and frequency increase of marine heat waves. And these are, from an ecological perspective, organisms are not reacting to the means, but to extremes. So over this going forward, there will be lots of disturbances that will disturb also our way of managing well the fisheries. And now coming back to something that you already pointed to, there have been modeling exercises of where on the planet there will be, given all we know, increases or decreases in fisheries. And in the Arctic there is a projection of increased fisheries going towards 2100 under most emission scenarios. However, I would like to caveat that if you look closely, and that is depicted also in the report, if you look closely, we don't have a lot of confidence in these results, especially not in the Arctic, because current oceanographic models and also the ecosystem part that is linked to that are not really reproducing the scale at which we have ecological interactions. And so there is not a lot of certainty in this going forward. Now I stop with that. Quickly on your second question. The report concludes that in order to manage better, we have to basically do ecosystem-based management that not only combines within-season measures, multi-season measures, but also manages along trajectory of forecast change. So that means to take the overall perspective of how the system is changing into account. And as that is linked with surprises, as I've just said, it needs to actually be a highly precautionary approach. It needs to be reflected in the governance of how we do that. And at the moment, I don't think we are well prepared in our management strategies to do that. We do good ecosystem-based management, people would say, in many of the Arctic fisheries. But actually, we have to go that next step if we want to sustain these very, very valuable fisheries. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. That was an excellent overview, and I had resisted from reporting or mentioning the IPCC special report on oceans and the cryosphere because it is thoroughly horrifying, actually, the the predictions and the projections going forward. But one thing that I did hear a frame the other day, which I think came from the high-level panel report, which was how can we view the oceans as a solution instead of a victim in terms of climate change? And I think that's a really fantastic frame, and it's the most hopeful frame that I'd like to go with in order to for us to continue to keep focusing on positive actions, because it is really, there are some really huge and, as you say, disruptive and activities that are going to face us already, but more. So now I think it's quite a nice lead-in actually for Monica, who is the Executive Director of Seas at Risk, and has really followed and advocated strongly for the development of regulations and legislations, particularly in the EU, on sustainable fisheries management, on marine health. And Monica, if you could just say a couple of things about how this all relates to what we have in legislation already. And we're using the EU as a case study because that's our focus, and what it means right now.
It is on, okay. Good afternoon, thank you for coming. Yeah, I would first like to grab some of the things that have been said already, just to get the frame right. So there has been this IPBES report on biodiversity that Angela also mentioned. And in that report, it is stated that the biggest impact on the marine environment so far has come from fishing. So far, I assume climate change will kick in soon, but for now, it's fishing. And we have learned that fish are very important in the carbon cycle, and that overfishing will undermine the resilience of the ocean. So ending overfishing is really a quick and a deliverable climate action which will restore fish populations. We know that the impact of climate change already, because of the heat already absorbed and the CO2 absorbed in the sea, will continue for at least 100 years to further impact the ocean. So we are talking really long-term damage. So what we really need is quick, deliverable actions that can take care of at least giving the ocean a fighting chance back in order to keep up its resilience. Ending overfishing would exactly do that. And it would rebuild fish populations. So we would get, plenty of fish in the sea. And that's not only good for ocean resilience, in fact, it's also good for the whole, for an economically viable fishing industry, a long-term sustainable, economically sustainable fishing industry, and the dependent coastal communities. Because if you have plenty fish of the sea, it's much easier to fish them. You don't have to go that far out. You don't have to haul that deep and so often in order to get the fish out. So it will actually reduce your fishing costs. It will reduce the fuel you need. So you have a direct climate mitigation thing there. And for the fishers, it will reduce the costs. Moreover, if you have more fish in the sea, as Rashid already explained very clearly, you can take out more fish without impacting the population. It will be able to replenish itself even if you take out more, simply because there are more fish around to reproduce. So it will also increase the profits, and that could be translated into jobs or profit for an industry, but it will make the fishing industry more profitable. So this is actually something which is not that often there, that actually a very direct environmental action will also have a very direct economically win. So it's really a win-win situation. And this was recognized. There are already international commitments on ending overfishing, and I'm pretty sure we'll hear more about that later from Ambassador Thompson. Now, I know more about the EU, so apologies, I'll now focus a little bit on the EU. Because in the EU, since '82, fisheries has been regulated by a common fisheries policy. So all EU member states come together and they agree jointly on how to regulate the fisheries, recognizing that fish don't keep to the boundary. Spanish fish will go to Portuguese waters or whatever. But since '82 there has been this policy, and it has been failing tremendously. Fish stocks have gone down. Fishers had to leave the business because they went bust. It has been a very negative spiral. So in 2000, around 2013, EU member states decided, okay, we're going to overhaul this policy, we're going to make it much better. And they did. And they came together, and in 2013 they all signed up to a fisheries law that has very high as one of the first principles, okay, we agree to end overfishing by 2015. And for the very latest, for some fish stocks where this might be a bit difficult, 2020. So in 2020, no overfishing will occur in European waters or by European vessels. And we all signed up to it. We are now in 2019. In the Northeast Atlantic, fish stocks are about 41% of the fish stocks are being overfished, 41%. In the Mediterranean, this is even 87%. Complete vast majority of the fish stocks being overfished. So how do they get to the decisions, and how do they get to these decisions that are clearly not in line with what they had all signed up to? EU fisheries ministers come together every year, towards the end of the year, sit down in a room, nobody knows what they're doing there, but they come out and they show, okay, we've decided this is the fishing limits for next year, for this fish stock, for this fish stock, for this fish stock. And every year they come out there with a law pending, looming there, a deadline to end overfishing, and still they come out there, okay, we're going to overfish this stock, and we're going to overfish this stock. It's not because of lack of science. They do have scientific advice that tells them exactly, this is the maximum amount of fish you can take out of the sea sustainably. And they do this every year in different instances. For example, this very week, the EU is negotiating with Norway because there's fish stocks where they are both fishing on, and they are going to agree now, or have just agreed today, I'm not quite sure, how much fish they will be taking out of the sea. Odds are that they will decide again to continue overfishing. And in 10 days, the EU fishing ministers will come together in Brussels, and they are going to negotiate the fishing limits for 2020 for all the fish stocks in the Northeast Atlantic. And indications are that, again, they will continue overfishing. So continuing overfishing is not only bad for the marine environment, it is not only bad for socio-economic aspects of the industry. I mean, in the short term they might gain something, but in the longer term they lose their fish stocks, they lose their income, fishing industry. It's also, what was I saying, environmentally, economically, and then, of course, for climate and ocean resilience, it doesn't make sense at all. We have now a new law where everybody underwrote, but it's obvious the political will is not there. So why is there not political will when there's an obvious, all these reasons to stop overfishing? Basically, fisheries ministers see fish as the resource for the industry and food. They do not see, they do not realize that it's also a very important part of the marine ecosystems and very important for ocean resilience. So we have fisheries ministers with a direct interest in fish, inviting representatives of the fishing industry into their meetings. But of course the impact of overfishing concerns the entire ocean. It goes much further than those who have a direct interest in fishing, because it concerns all of us, because the ocean is our life support system. And therefore the only way to solve this, it seems, if they're not abiding by law and they're not willing to listen to all the very sound arguments there are to end overfishing, perhaps fisheries ministers should not be the only ones deciding about fish, because fish is for all of us, because it's part of a marine ecosystem. So perhaps decisions about fishing limits should be taken out of the realm of fisheries ministers because they can't handle that responsibility because they don't have the broad vision that you need to take responsible decisions. And perhaps it should be taken more and become part of national climate plans, as you had suggested.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica, very much for that observation. I think now we have the perfect follow-on from you. Jacob is going to be is representing the Swedish government and the Swedish ministry, but I think and what I think would be very interesting to hear from you, Jacob, is, of course, you don't need to comment on your fisheries minister's decisions, but it would be really interesting to hear from you exactly, is Sweden, are other governments looking at sustainable fisheries management, at ending overfishing as an action that will contribute to a climate action plan? Have they started doing it? What is stopping them from doing it, or what are the next steps to get governments more understanding and engaged in this particular frame?
Thank you. Well, let me first say that personally I'm totally convinced that sustainable fisheries management would improve ocean resilience. There's no question about that. And Sweden is a strong supporter of the MSY approach and so on, of course. But of course we are part of a management system within EU and also with our neighbor countries. So we're never going to be better than our management system and how that works. I think when it comes to the direct connection to climate and ocean sequestration effects and so on, there's no such link at the moment. Not at all. It's not part of the discussions at all yet.
Yeah.
But I think the way the blue COP is set up and so on, it's moving that direction, but we're definitely not there yet. But I think when it comes to what governments can do today, I think what we see, especially in occasions like this, governments talk a lot about IUU. And it's interpreted as illegal fishery, because that's something you can blame on other countries, what the other countries do. But countries tend to forget about the unregulated and the unreported fishery. And actually, most of the catches taken today are taken through legal fishery. So the biggest impact from the fishing industry, it's within the legal realm, really. And that legal fishery is very often not properly regulated or reported. So I think that's a very good starting point where countries could definitely start in their own national fisheries, in their own national waters. Manage your fisheries well in your own waters, but it's politically more sensitive to work to limit your own fishermen than talking about other fishermen. I totally agree with your point on the EU fishery. We've set a law that actually made it illegal to have unsustainable fisheries. We set MSY as a legal requirement for a fishery, which was great, but we're not going to be able to handle it. I think part of the curse in fisheries, because it seemed to be super difficult everywhere, and I think part of the curse is all the science which is around it. Because it makes you get the impression that it's a very exact science. It's something where you can negotiate 100 tons here to 50 tons there. While the estimates of fish stocks and the possible catches have huge confidence intervals around those figures. And I think, as you said, that there is a need for a much more precautionary approach around those. And countries tend to think that if we don't optimize fishery today, we will lose something, instead of understanding that what we don't fish today is still there next year to be fished then if we did something wrong this year. So I think my first point here is very similar to Monica's. I think the popular fisheries management systems that are used around the world today are not really fit for purpose to handle those short-term sacrifices that sometimes need to be made to get the long-term gains. And I think it would be very interesting to think of a different way of managing fisheries, which sort of takes us around that issue. My second point I would like to make is that in our waters around Sweden, we see more and more evidence that some of the ecosystem changes we see in our waters are actually due to that we have changed the species composition in the sea, rather than eutrophication and too much nutrients and so on. We have scientific articles now showing that 50% of those symptoms that look like it's because of nutrients actually is because of lack of big predatory fish. So that also tells us that fisheries, if handled properly, could probably help us to improve the state of our ecosystem, as has been presented previously here. And I think this means that fisheries management should not only make sure that every stock is healthy. Fisheries managers actually have to also think about what is the species composition, because it matters whether it's lots of predators or lots of small pelagic fish. And I think especially with the future climate change, that is something that we would need to take into account, but we're not at all there today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Jacob. So we now have some time for questions, if anybody has any questions of the speakers. Yes. Do we have?
Hello, my name is Miklos Espremi. I'm a student at Yale University. A study by Christopher Costello from 2014 predicted that closing off the high seas completely to fishing, not sustainable fishing, no fishing, would increase global fish stocks by about 150% worldwide, and would lead to a doubling in profit just because the EEZs can actually replenish themselves. How do you guys feel of something like that, and why are we waiting for that?
Rashid, do you want to answer that question?
Thank you for raising that. You are from Yale, yeah? So you don't know about UBC. Before Costello, there was Sumaila, okay? Talking about this. This is something that has occupied my attention since the mid-2000s, you know? Our first paper on that was 2007. And we have similar conclusions like Chris Costello, actually. Yeah, so close the high seas. And I alluded to that a bit in my talk, but, you know, because of time, right? So essentially what we find is if we are brave enough to close the whole high seas to fishing, we'll get biodiversity benefits. The fish will get a break. In fact, I said we should make the high seas the fish bank of the world, where the fish can get peace, get away from all our disturbances. Then they feed back into the system. So there will be biodiversity benefit and economic ones, because then you don't have to travel far and deep. And climate ones, you don't have to pump out too much CO2. And one other angle we put in was equity. Because at the moment, 5 to 10 countries take almost 80% of all the values from the high seas. The big fishing nations, China, Korea, Spain here. Okay, so Japan, of course, there are about 10 of them. They take, but if we close the high seas, smaller countries like the Pacific ones, Guinea-Bissau will get some when the fish come in. So we even calculated the Gini coefficient of the current distribution of income. Everybody knows the Gini coefficient. That is the economic indicator of the degree of distribution of income in a country. And we calculated that for the current situation in the high seas, it's actually the worst distribution of any country in the world. And if you close the high seas, that improves it to the best of any country in the world. Do you know which country is the worst in the world in Gini coefficient? South Africa. We don't have time. South Africa is, and you all know why, appetite. And the best one is actually Sweden. Aha. So you turn it from South African to Swedish. Wouldn't you like that? Who wouldn't like that? So you are right on, my friend. Close the high seas to fishing.
Yeah, I want to make a remark about that as well, because you were asking why aren't we not doing it. I mean, it's an obvious no-brainer also because the inspection on the high seas is not there, and because regional fisheries management organizations who are supposed to manage the fisheries on the high seas are not always fit for purpose. Their governance systems basically allow continued overfishing as well. It would be a very simple solution. So yes, and obviously simple solutions are never there to be taken because of politics. Right now, they are in the middle of the negotiations on areas beyond national jurisdiction, how to protect those. If any of this, let's just close high seas fisheries, comes through strongly, I can tell you I have very severe doubts on how those negotiations will go, because then countries will pull out, because then, it goes against their direct interests. And RFMOs are very much against it because, it's our territory. We know how to deal with high seas fisheries, stay out of our territory. So basically, it is a simple, good solution. It would, of course, have some fishing companies go bust. But perhaps if they would not get all the fuel subsidies they are getting these days, perhaps they would go bust anyway. But it is a political decision in the end. And as I just already explained, politicians are not even up for ending overfishing, let alone ending fishing in the high seas.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Maybe I stand up so you can see me. Thank you very much for these comments and answers. So I think maybe I missed it. There's the SDG 14, one of it that matures next year. So if BBNJ could do it, the instrument, it could declare closure on the whole high seas for fisheries, but we also have the SDG 14 maturing next year to end fishery subsidies, and so this is another instrument, and this matures next year, and WTO has to take this decision. And this must be done not only for the ocean, but it is a clear signal for all the SDGs. If the ocean SDGs that mature next years are not met, this is a signal to all other SDGs. So this is really necessary. This is unacceptable if this is not met. So we must focus on BBNJ. This is important, but also on the WTO. So we have a couple of events next year that mature. So yeah, this is one point. And now my question to Angela. Okay, thank you. I know many people are fixed on numbers, so I'm still in this bubble a little bit. But the more I'm here, I come to the conclusion not this crisis is by our minds, but by our hearts. We have to connect with the ocean, not by numbers, but by our emotions, and to really think what. But however, I'm still in this bubble, and can you quantify somehow how the carbon storage and sequestration potential of fish carbon, of oceanic carbon, is compared, for example, to whale carbon? We have this number in this in this article on the online magazine of the International Monetary Fund that whale carbon, a big whale, for example, stores 33 gigatons of carbon in his body, and this sinks down to the earth after he dies, sinks down. So is this, can you compare this a little bit so that we have some numbers to put it in? And so if this is the case, or fish is oceanic carbon is relevant not only to the food, but to the food web, but also to our climate. So, and as you said, the fisheries departments and governments are not able to tackle this responsibility. So why are there any chances to declare fisheries as a common heritage of mankind, so that we all can claim that this is protected? Fisheries and the ocean health is a common heritage of mankind, and if anyone disrupts, plunders, continues to plunder our common heritage, that we can make these people accountable for stealing our future and the future of the generations to come. Thank you.
Great comment and question. Just to flag for you, we will, Ambassador Peter Thompson is here and he will be giving us a short talk on the big global picture with the SDGs as well, but that's a sneak preview. So, Angela.
We're not there yet with the science on fish. We've got some numbers, but they're very small, but then they focus on one species in one ecosystem and only one of the interactions. But it's so complex that I don't know if we will be able to get there, estimating the numbers. And when you think about the role of fish versus other parts of the ocean carbon cycle, those numbers just pale in insignificance. So it's more that they're an intrinsic part of the function as a whole. So I'm not sure if we'll ever have the numbers. There are some fish that we know do more for carbon sinking and sequestration than others, like the mesopelagic fish that have this style vertical migration. And there are numbers associated with those in some studies. But again, they're not that comparative to other parts of the ocean that do a lot more. But yeah, they are an integral piece of the puzzle. So,
can I talk?
Yeah.
Quick ones, first, Monica, about the high seas. I agree with you. It's difficult. People are going to push back, but actually, I don't think it's completely crazy. You never know, right? You throw out the idea and you never know where it goes. In fact, the first large high seas marine protected area was declared in December 2017. The Ross Sea is closed. Nobody ever thought that would happen. So, just get the idea out. And it's a few people that are making the money, so the rest of us can actually get it done. I'm always end up on the optimistic side, right? And Angela, you are right. It's very complicated, the carbon. So the way I deal in our group at UBC, we're quite crazy group, right? So we go to first principles. And what you can say almost for sure, with all the complications, everything being equal, if we have more fish in the ocean, it's going to help climate change than not. Could we say that, Angela? I know you are in the deep science, which is great. But you could say that, everything being equal. So, and when things are too complicated, you know what you do? You look for simple solutions. If we give a mathematician a very difficult problem, you know what she does? She simplifies it, get it simple, and you get a real good solution, right? So that is probably what we need here.
Have another question over here.
Hello, I'm Matthew Costa. I'm a postdoc at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I have two questions. One a specific science question, and one sort of a broader question. So I'm one of those. I study those coastal plants you talked about in blue carbon ecosystems. So I'm very interested in the efficiency of burial of organic matter and sediment. And when I was in this talk, I thought about what do you guys think about the role of trawling in disrupting benthic ecosystems and what that affecting their net heterotrophic or not status, and also breaking up sediment organic matter and exposing it to being released back into the ocean for respiration. So that's a very specific question. More broadly, we're here at this international meeting. How can we approach linking global policy ideas to local action, especially in the context of small-scale fisheries?
Thank you. Angela, would you like to respond to the first question?
So the first question, I think it's an important question. I had this same thought when when people were discussing deep sea mining, because obviously a lot of carbon has accumulated in the deep seas over a long, long time. And I had that similar questions, but I don't know if there's been anything done on that specifically.
Rashid, this is something that is touched on in your working paper, but it is an issue that we have discussed in looking at this science. I mean, basically, ending overfishing as climate action is a relatively new concept. I mean, it's something that we looked at and went, oh, nobody's really talking about this. They're talking about how climate change impacts fisheries, but not how fisheries impact climate change. So we have identified a number of areas in terms of the quantification of how much carbon does a fish take, or the impact of destructive fishing practices if they have a higher carbon impact, for example. But Rashid, you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah. Okay. So we are planning to do some deep studies here, and I just got the Frontiers in Marine Science to create a research topic on this issue. And our hope is that in the next 1.5 years, we'll publish about 10 papers on this. Angela, you're on board. I didn't tell you, right? So we put the team and look at this more deeply. But you know what? Actually, we double into this. And when I say we, Alex Rogers of Oxford University, then he was at Oxford. One summer I visited him, and we actually looked at the carbon value, the sequestration value of big animals taking carbon down in the high seas, and we compared it to the value of the fish we catch in the high seas. It's in the report we did for the Global Ocean Commission, actually. And you know what we found? Alex and his team, they did the quantification, very rough, I have to give that up, but they did something. And I put in the economic value. What we found was that the value of the carbon was 10 times the value of the fish we catch from the high seas and eat. So there you go. So there is some evidence at least, but yeah. Mm-hmm. How about the global question?
There is another question just over here.
This is Silke Birds from the YMCA, and thank you for the interesting presentation. But when I try to explain to people that we should end overfishing and that we should have healthy fish stocks that will be resilient and healthy to face climate change, then they tell me, oh, climate change will come anyway, and that fishing is just a minor impact, and that there's no use of stopping it because then climate change will come and change everything anyway again. So how can I explain to them that there's still some reason in not doing overfishing? And I think the essential question is, in which magnitudes are we playing? Is the shift from overfishing to sustainable fishing, can this shift overcompensate the effects of climate change, like with the migrating species and changing ecosystems? So what can I answer to them?
Excellent. I think we have a couple of people here on the panel who'd like to respond to that. And I'd like to interject because I've got the microphone. But I do think that it's quite interesting, the IPBES report on biodiversity and ecosystem services earlier in 2019 predicted that we were threatening 1 million species with extinction. And this is not a crisis that has arrived in the last few years. It's not a crisis that we've been learning a lot about, as in with climate change, where the science is moving so quickly, and even though we've known about it for decades, obviously it's been accelerating very quickly, very recently. The biodiversity crisis we've known about for decades, and overfishing and fishing, as Monica pointed out, is the biggest threat to the ocean that we have. So I guess for many people that I work with, scientists, campaigners, governments, the biodiversity crisis is as big as the climate crisis, because the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that provide us with the air we breathe, the water, etc., it is very, very important and integral and cannot be disconnected almost from the climate. But that's my interjection. Now I'll hand to the panel.
Can I go? Yeah. So this is a real question, and some of my economics friends actually argue the same thing. They will tell you, because climate change is coming, take out all the fish and put the money in the bank. And I've heard it again and again. But I think it's quite crazy if you think that way. You know, I take you to West Africa. You know, I have a little saying in West Africa. We say, because I'm going to die, I shouldn't sleep. You know, you get it. So essentially, it's capturing this idea that you have to keep doing your best, no matter what you are facing, because you really don't know, right? So, and people ask me, and I'm sure Peter and all of you, journalists, are you optimistic? I say, what option do I have? I mean, you mean I'll just stay in bed and I can't do anything? No, for two reasons. My forebearers will just kill me. I mean, can you imagine all those who fought all this to get all of us in this room now? Men, women, black, white, yellow, green, you know. I mean, this is what we are working at. And I added it by saying, can you imagine what Nelson Mandela will think in his grave if I, Rashid, I sit here and say I'm pessimistic in that cell room? So we don't have option to that. Tell them to go jump into the ocean when they tell you that. We need to do our best no matter the obstacles we face. All right? Yeah. Somebody wants to add?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, coming from the perspective again of the recent IPCC reports, I would say that you can throw that answer right back to them and actually remind them that the primary response option that people have to limit the risks from climate change are actually to fall back on the ecosystem services and on ecosystem-based approaches. So a functioning ecosystem will be the basis, the best basis for adapting to climate change in many, many places along many, many coastlines for many, many people. And so in order to keep these systems producing something, they will produce something also under climate change. We should carefully and proactively manage. That's the message that these reports end on.
I just wanted to add on to that as well. It's not an either or thing. We really need everyone to do everything. So it's both things. If we're saying that we need to manage fish better, we are already assuming that we've cut emissions as well. So otherwise, yeah, everything's going to change. We need to have strong climate action as well before any of this really matters. But we're going with, they're going to do something. They have to do something.
All hands on deck.
Yeah. And I just want to mention that, as I pointed out, I really think we are in an emergency, so every little bit helps. And this is one of the things we can do tomorrow, or in 10 days, EU fisheries ministers could do it. So this is a really quick way to at least give a little bit more hope to the ocean. So I think, yeah, you better throw that back at them.
Monica, can I give a little story to help her?
Sure.
You know, a few years ago, there was a story out of London. This guy was sick. He goes to the doctor, and they tell him, you are going to go in 6 months, given all that they know. You know, they tell you that whether it's cancer. They give you a deadline. You know what the guy did? He went off after his pension. He opened up his pension box. He's going to spend everything before the 6 months. And he actually did that. But the 6 month came and he didn't die. He didn't die. This was how I heard the news. It was in the news. He set up a tent begging for money to continue living. That's what will happen if you think that way. All right? Yeah.
That was beautiful. Are there any final questions? Because I think we might move to our wrap up otherwise. Yeah, okay. You can have the final question.
No, last comment about that. Well, we play around with these numbers, 1.5 or 2, and it's just half a degree, but it has been calculated that translates into 150 million deaths as direct results of climate change. So to make that argument is to say, well, I'm complicit in a death toll that makes everything else that have ever happened in human history just nothing. So it's a moral argument at the end of the day.
I think that's a good point, and I think we might close the panel Q&A for now. If you'd like everyone to thank the speakers, thank you so much for your time. So to finish off from that very interesting conversation and discussion, thank you everyone for your contributions. I'd like to bring it back to the big picture. So someone mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And today we are very honoured to have the Ambassador Peter Thompson, who is the UN Special Envoy for the Ocean. And his job, his one and only ambition for operating right now is for the advocacy and outreach and to galvanise efforts to deliver on the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I'm going to hand over to Peter because I think he can talk about that a lot more clearly than I. Thank you.
Hey, just as you were saying those words, I was thinking, what's my motivation here? And I realized it's actually selfishness. And I think I want to talk to you about being more selfish, okay? Not about altruism, which is what I usually preach on about. It's actually about selfishness, and I'll get to that point. But firstly, I just want to emphasize the fact that some of you might think you're at COP25. You're not. You're at the Blue COP, okay? Have a look around. There's hundreds of ocean events on. It's taken us a long time to get here, by the way. Sweden and Fiji, we started the Ocean Pathway a few years ago, and people thought we were crazy trying to bring ocean into climate change talks. What? That's like trying to bring ocean into biodiversity talks. You know, what a terrible things. We've got silos. Don't you realize we've got bureaucracies that deal with these things and never shall the twain meet? Well, that's obviously rubbish. And we've got the super year coming up next year where we've got the biodiversity conference. We've got the climate conference in Glasgow. We've got the ocean conference in Lisbon. And those three have to be absolutely in step. And I'm working on projects to bring that glue together right now. Please don't ever let whoever that person was that mentioned that about the fact that you can't do that. That's biodiversity. Well, more biodiversity in the ocean than anywhere else. You know, you can't have climate. You can't have ocean and climate. We're talking about climate change here. Well, sorry, the ocean is what creates the climate on this planet. So anyway, you get my point. Welcome to the Blue COP, and I think we all have to be so grateful to Spain and to Chile for making it happen, and really spread that word loud and clear, because you'll still find some old diehards who think we should all be in our boxes. I want to say that my main message is just to echo what Antonio Guterres said to the 193 member states here when he opened this Blue COP. He said, and think about these words, he said, if you read the 3 IPCC reports that were produced this year, the one on ocean and cryosphere, the one on land, and the one on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, read those reports, and you will see that humanity is destroying the life support system of this planet. That humanity, he used the word, is knowingly destroying. Now, that's not WWF or me or Greenpeace or somebody saying that. That's the head of the United Nations. That's like humanity is, finally woken up and said, my God, we are destroying our home. Not kind of hurting it a bit, destroying it. That's the context of the Blue COP. And nobody should underestimate the seriousness of the situation we're in. So that's a really important thing in terms of what are you thinking about while you're here, what are you going to take home with you. The other point that I really want to stress is that, and I'm sure you've heard me on this before, but you can't have a healthy planetary ecosystem if you don't have a healthy ocean ecosystem, right? It's just not possible. Do the math. And, as you've heard today, we're doing our best to really destroy that ocean ecosystem. I'm going to get around to fishing, but just let me say something about the selfishness thing first. I was just talking to a journalist before I came in here, and he was saying, because I had criticized New Zealand's cow culture. I'm from Fiji, but New Zealand's my second home. And I was saying, we're going to do something about it, not just New Zealand, but everywhere that's into cow culture. And, you know, that means eating less red meat and, you know, less dairy and cheese. And, you know, follow the flexitarian diet, which is what's been recommended to us all, you know, which involves a lot more fish, by the way, but that's got to be aquaculture, obviously, and a lot more plant-based food. So that's the recipe for human survival, you know, not eat more beef. The guy, of course, was objecting to that as a good New Zealand journalist. And he said, don't you realize, you know, that the Homo sapiens is a selfish species. We only think about ourselves. We're not concerned about the future. We want to have our meal every day and enjoy our beer and all the rest, you know. And you're on radio now to New Zealanders, right? What are you going to tell them, you know? So I said, look, I am motivated by selfishness. I'm not an altruist. I'm not an optimist, as was said. I'm just a pragmatist who is motivated by selfishness. And my selfishness is encapsulated in a day in New York about 5 years ago where my wife and I had just read the UN report on what beef is doing to this world, right, and the non-sustainability of that. And then we happened to look at a photograph of our grandchildren. And I said to my wife, you know, which one do you love more, the grandchildren or the beef we've been eating ever since we were born? And she said, well, the grandchildren, obviously. I said, well, what are we going to do? Well, obviously we've got to give up. And so, you know, everybody doesn't have to give up beef, but we did it on that day. We said, okay, we love our grandchildren more, we love beef, goodbye hamburger, etc., etc. So the good news is life's fine without beef, by the way. We are not suffering in any way. You can make those personal changes. So what is my selfishness? My selfishness and what gets me up every day, unlike that guy that you were talking about, what gets me up every day is the selfish drive to make sure that my grandchildren, yeah, not yours, my grandchildren, have a healthy life on this planet. And if you think selfishly like that as well, well, you know, hopefully all the grandchildren will be all right. But that is my motivation. You know, an old man like me, I should be sitting back in Fiji's underneath a coconut tree reading a novel. You know, I kind of earned that time. But I could not do that without just breaking into a sweat after 5 minutes because I'd be worried about what's going to happen to my 3 granddaughters in 20 years' time. I couldn't do it. You know, it was just, you know, anyway, you get the point. So selfishness, let it motivate you. We must give a future to our children and grandchildren. I said I'd get to fishing. Let's say a bit about that. Again, I like being controversial. Come on, wakes us all up. Fishermen are not some special category of human being. If fishermen carry out crimes, they need to be punished. The way that people on land, if they carry out crimes, need to be punished. There is 1 fish in 5 in this planet which is stolen. Stolen from communities, stolen from countries, stolen from science. Because how are we going to manage our fish stocks if we've got to somehow factor in those stolen fish? Now, there are lots of countries which would retort very quickly to me and say, Peter, you're trying to turn fishermen into criminals. No, no, no. Fishermen are just human beings. Businesses that run fishing businesses are just businesses like on land. They're not some special category of humanity. You do your crime and you pay for it, right? As they find out if they go into Indonesian waters where the boats are blown up. But that's my first point. And why am I being so controversial in saying that? Because there's over $20 billion worth of fish being stolen every year. All of us have been receivers of stolen goods. How do you feel about that? You've been indulging in criminal behavior, accepting in your fish and chips stolen goods. Would you do that if it was a diamond ring, or would you, if somebody was stealing 1 in 5 cows to put in hamburgers at, I won't mention the chain, but you know the one I mean, would you still, you know, buy their hamburgers? No, you wouldn't, right? So you need to be a pain in the ass like me, and every time you order fish, say, where did you get this fish from? You know, can you tell me that it's... And I tell you, most chefs, if you ask them that, and I asked them that in a restaurant here in Madrid last night, they like it when you say that. Because most chefs now go to a lot of trouble to get sustainable fish and to get legally caught fish. So that's one point. The second point I want to say, and it was touched on before, is about subsidies. That overcapacity that we so often hear about, where we are sending out industrial fleets to chase diminishing stocks of fish, right? 33% of the world's fish stocks are overfished. only can be done because of the subsidies that governments are giving. Public monies, which our governments, our elected politicians, are giving to industrial fleets to go out and strip the ocean of diminishing stocks of fish. Where is the sense in that? There isn't any. And so I come back, I'm getting the bummer's rush here, but I get back to this thing of individual responsibility. Don't buy stolen fish. Don't elect people to your parliaments who are not on board with the need for not just getting re-elected in 3 years' time, but to think about the future of the ocean and our grandchildren. Right? Don't elect those kind of people. So you've got an individual responsibility to do that if you care about the ocean's health. And the last word I would say is we have got a plan, which is the Paris Climate Agreement and the SDGs, and you heard about SDG 14, and 4 of its targets mature next year and will be addressed in Lisbon when we all get together there at the UN Ocean Conference. Stick to the plan, implement it with integrity, and we will be okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you everybody for coming. In very quick closing, the tagline for this conference is Time for Action. This is the Blue COP. The ocean and ending overfishing is a solution. It's a climate action, and if you'd like more information, please join us afterwards to ask questions. Thank you so much, and thanks again for the Cryosphere for hosting us.
impact of disappearing sea ice on the youth communities of the Arctic. So, without further ado, let's welcome Darcy. So we had a few technical issues, we just lost the power here, but we're finally back on track for this side event focusing on disappearing sea ice, the impact on youth circumpolar communities. And we're going to start with Darcy from the Woods Hole Institute. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Let me just try that.